Welcome to the Art and Science of Marketing Communications with Lauren Pernicoms. I am Lauren Perna.
And I am Brian M. Reiser. Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello. So we are super excited. This is a topic that we have heard so much questions on. And it's really kind of a continuation of what we talked about last week, is that when you're managing multiple brands, and one of those multiple brands is your own personal brand, how do you kind of find that sweet spot of like oversharing and underconnecting with people? Like, what do I post for my personal brand that feels like that Goldilocks? That's why we called this finding the Goldilocks sweet spot in personal brand content. How do I find that content that feels just right? Bearing in mind that what feels just right to me might be a little different for somebody else. So that's kind of the first thing to level set before we answer kind of these standard questions we always get, is that always remembering, you are your own unique person. There is kind of no parameter that everyone should follow, as far as like how much to share. We'll talk about the parameters that do exist, but just because I talk about, my mental health challenges and being, a sober person, does not mean that you need to personally dive into that much of your life. That is just what I feel passionate about talking about. So that's just kind of like the level set we want to start with. Brian, anything to add on your end?
Yeah, that's right. I would just say that there's no rule or law about what you have to share. It comes down to you. The Goldilocks spot for me or for Lauren or for you might be different, and so you have to tune into your own Goldilocks spot to figure out what is the right amount of sharing for you and on what topics.
And I think that's a good intro to our first question, which is, how do you find that? Like, what is that sweet spot? And I think, first of all, it's figuring out, what you feel most comfortable with, but it really is figuring out that kind of intersection of your experience, not necessarily your personal life, but your experience as it relates to your expertise, your professional life. How does everything that kind of happened to you in the past, whether that is something like a job or a skill set, or on the other end, your mental health, how does that tie into what you want to be a thought leader on? Um, and then from there, it's figuring out how much of that do you feel comfortable sharing. And really, at the end of the day, you want to tap into your own intuition. You just kind of know. I mean, and I think that's always the kind of threshold that I go through is, if I write something up and I go to hit post and I'm not feeling like this is a good move, then I'm not going to do it. And maybe I'll come back to it and decide that, there is a time and a place for it. But listen, just because I write something, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to go out there. So I think at a bare minimum, it is kind of trusting your intuition, but it is also figuring out that kind of intersection of your personal life, your experiences, all the things that have happened to you, and how that has fueled what you want to be a thought leader and an expert in today. Brian, I'll kick it over to you to kind of add to that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, I think. And I think part of that is thinking about it from a strategic and intentional perspective. And I think one of the worst things you can often do is post something in the heat of the moment. I had an experience the other day with this actually, where I've seen a number of fellow SEOs talking about something in particular, it really set me off because I just think it's so wrongheaded, and I see it over and over again. And I was like, all right, I gotta write a post about this. And so I did, and I didn't hit send on LinkedIn, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, wow, this came out really snarky. And I thought about it, and I did not pull the trigger. And I intend to write about this subject, but I was like, this is not the right moment. You're feeling the heat in this moment. Like, take a step back, put it into your social media plan, write a well thought out post explaining your feelings, why you're feeling this way, and why you think this. And be really intentional about it, because the point isn't just to make people angry. The point is to make them think, or share something about your
That's
expertise,
true.
or bring something to the table that's really going to help people, not just to emote your feelings. And I think that's what I was doing in that moment. And I was like, that's not what I want to be doing here. That's not helpful to me. It's not helpful to the people I want to serve.
Yeah, and I think that that's an awesome point because even though it was very authentic,
Hmm.
it was not trustworthy because you sounded snarky. And
Hmm.
that's, the two kind of perimeters that you do want to make sure you're hitting. You want to make sure that what you're talking about is authentic and exhibiting trust. And I think that's why when people kind of go off the rails, or celebrities, kind of don't get things approved by their social media team, and it comes across as snarky or rude or inconsiderate, you kind of lose trust in them, and you're like, geez, like, I can't believe whoever wrote that whole thing on Instagram. You just kind of feel like, wow, I thought I knew them. So it really kind of jeopardizes that trustworthiness when you go off the rails. And I think there is a certain way to be controversial and,
Hmm.
you know, ask people to really think about this topic that's going around. But just because you're authentic doesn't necessarily mean you're trustworthy. So it's really, that's where the sweet spot also lies, not just kind of the interface of your experience and your brand and your expertise, but also the interface of authenticity and trustworthiness. Um, and that's kind of, I think leads to our next question is, how do you build that trust without compromising privacy? And this is probably what most people mean when they ask us, what do I say? How do I say it? Or they say to us, I just don't want to share my life. Listen, we're not asking you to share your life at all. You don't need to share your kids. You don't need to share your dog as much as I do. But you do need to talk about yourself outside of the role that you do every day. And that's different from, talking about, like I said, your family or, your personal kind of life. It's about digging beyond that. What brought you to this career? Why, what are some of the challenges that you experienced that you can talk about in, like Brian said, a strategic way? I have a lot of connections that are in patient advocacy. So there is a lot of nitty gritty that these folks could share. We are not asking them to share, exactly what happened when they got to the hospital. We don't need your blood type or anything like that. But we are asking them to share, okay, you got to the hospital. You don't even need to tell us why, but what did that inspire you to do or be or say? That's kind of more what we talk about when we say, we want you to share your story, not necessarily the nitty gritty details. It's more the nitty gritty feelings and emotions. Um, what do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's right on. For starters, I don't think there's any piece of your personal life that anyone is entitled to. So you get to decide, what is in bounds and what is out of bounds. Of course, we're all glad that you do share a lot about your dog, but if you didn't want to, that's not something you have to do. That is a choice that is in your power. So I think that's really important. There's no entitlement. And to that end, at the same time, your social media personality is not your diary. You shouldn't share everything. You shouldn't share every detail. You have a right to privacy, and you should respect your own boundaries and your own privacy. And really, kind of like what you said about sharing, the spirit of the story of your experience, how it helped you, how it can help you serve your audience, without sharing every nitty gritty detail that they don't need to know, because they don't.
No. And so a perfect example is I was at dinner with some fellow entrepreneurs. And obviously, as you guys know, I do talk a lot about my dog because she's really inspired me on my journey. And she's just a part of the LPC team. And I said something like, "Oh, my stepson." And this woman was like, "I had no idea you had stepsons, Lauren." And it's just not something that I talk too much about online because they are adults. They do have their own lives. I really want to respect their privacy. Every once in a while, I'll show John, my husband, because he is a part of my team, whether he likes it or not. And we also have another business that I support him with. So in kind of those senses, I talk about him. But at the end of the day, your kids are their own people. Your family is there. You don't know exactly how much they feel comfortable unless you ask them and talk to them, and you really kind of involve them in the process. So that's why I don't really talk about my family too much beyond what you've already seen on my page. So I think that's just a good example of how I separate some aspects of my personal life with my personal brand. Yeah, personal brand is not personal life. It is, your brand, your kind of outward image. That
Yeah,
said,
yeah.
we do want it to be authentic. So, oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just thinking a lot. I had a conversation recently with somebody about how you see more and more celebrities who are, the original influencers, Hollywood people, um, how they are taking their private lives back a little bit, and they're saying, like, you don't get to talk about this subject, or, you don't get to necessarily interrupt my private dinner and ask me for an autograph. And some people think that that's like an entitled sense from celebrities. And I think, you know what? Great for people for owning their space, knowing what they feel is appropriate for them and not appropriate. And like I said, I think we can all take a lesson in that, and be sure that, we don't have to overshare. We don't have to give away every detail or every piece of our private lives to the public. We can really learn from that, I think. But that is a good segue into, I think, where you were going, which is, on the other hand, you don't want to just be a business machine.
Exactly. So just because you are being authentic doesn't necessarily mean you're building trust. And one example is when people are kind of creating these personal brand posts that feel very contrived, or maybe a little chat GBT helping hand, or maybe someone else wrote them for them. I feel like you can always kind of tell, just because it's authentic, because it really is your story that you've kind of popped into chat GPT, doesn't necessarily mean that it is serving a purpose or fueling business, because it just doesn't feel authentic in the sense that people are believing that you wrote it. And that's what we mean when we say business machine, is that sometimes these posts that people are putting out there feel much more like they're pretending to be a personal brand than actually being a personal brand. And that's really where the interface of authenticity and trust comes in, because just because you think you're being authentic, if you're really not, you're not going to be trustworthy. And the goal of a personal brand is to not only get people to trust you and believe in you, but to kind of build business growth or professional growth, or whatever your kind of goal is. You're not achieving that by having ChatGPT write your post for you. um and we were kind of talking about this beforehand, is that just because it's a true story that you've shared, if it's very clear that you didn't write it, or that it was kind of part of a contrived strategy, um, then that's not going to move the needle. And I think there's a difference between having kind of like a strategy and something that's much more contrived. Um, you can always tell when someone has kind of popped something into ChatGPT, and maybe we can excuse that if it's for, a promotional post or something like that. But when it's your personal brand, it really needs to come from your voice. And if you're having a ghostwriter write it, that's completely fine, but they need to do a damn good job at becoming you. And that is one of the things that I like to pride myself on, is really tapping into someone's own voice. And we could talk a little bit about how we do that here, and kind of walk you through that process. But think the biggest part is reading something and being like, yeah, Brian actually wrote that. Like, that is so true. What I hear a lot is like, I read your post and I can hear you saying it in my head. And that's just the way I write. So yeah, and I'll pass it over to you now to kind of talk about that authentic piece of authenticity.
Yeah, I love that. That idea of like hearing the voice in your head as you're reading it. I think that is the goal, because it shows that like you really tapped into something that is true to you. You're not faking it. And like you said, like AI is great. It is a helpful tool. I use it all the time for, ideation and coming up with structure and getting research. But at the end of the day, it is just a tool. And you don't want to be a robot. You don't want to be a machine. You don't want to seem like a fake person. You want to be you, because that's who people want to buy from. They want to buy from you. They want to feel like, oh, this is a person I know. This is a person I understand. This person gets it. And you can't fake that. You have to show up as yourself and be willing to share something, not everything. Um, and just be a person and be the person that you are, and that is how over time you are going to show people that you are, really who you say you are and can do the things you say you can do.
And that's what drives business or career growth, is
Mhm.
because you are showing up as yourself. And I think that's what we mean, when we talk about how can your personal brand interface with your career or your business, especially if you're an entrepreneur or an executive. Because at the end of the day, people buy from people. We say this all the time. Apparently, I said the other day, and I don't even remember it, is that people don't buy from logos. They buy from actual people. Or maybe someone else said it and I just copied them. And if that was you, I'm really sorry. Brian thought I said it, so I'm taking credit. Um, so that's just me being authentically me. But anyway, you know, this is really, we are in a world where there's a lot of competition. There are a lot of people doing exactly what you do. So what's going to set you apart is who you are. Your experience, your personal brand is really what sets you apart. And that's where sharing, finding that Goldilocks sweet spot for yourself, building trust without going overboard, sharing authentic posts that aren't contrived. That's really where it makes a difference to fuel business growth, because people are realizing that you are the person behind the brand. You are trustworthy. You're sharing real things. You are showing them how you got to be where you are and why you are passionate about this. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to always talk about your business or your company. You're really focusing on the skills and the expertise you have to offer. For an executive, it might be a little different, and it might be much more about their role as part of the company. And LPC helps a couple of executives in that capacity, and it's really a much stronger overlap with the company because they are so high ranking at the company. But if you were a career person or a person that is starting a business or a side hustle, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily interface with your business as much as it does your skills and your experience. That's kind of more where I would lean, especially if you're kind of just starting your personal brand.
Yeah. So one thing that has worked for me quite a bit is when I want to talk about, really kind of deep SEO, or more into my service offerings and what my business does and things like that, I tend to lean a little bit more into the company page. But when I want to talk about softer skills, mindset, how I got to where I am, what it takes to be doing business right now, all that kind of stuff, that is, I think, gold for your personal brand, and where you really get to shine and it help inspire people and teach them about how you get to do the things that you do and be the person that you are. Because I think people want to buy from people that not only have something valuable to offer, but that inspire them and make them feel something, and have passion about something. That's who I want to buy from. That's who I want to work with. So I mean, it's one of the reasons I love working with you, Lauren, is because I see your,
Aw.
no, it's true. It's authentic. Because I see how mission driven you are, and how you really do care about the things you talk about, especially Tessie. So
Yes.
I think that is it, it just draws people in. It's a magnet, and it makes people really interested in working with you and doing business with you. And I think that's the goal for all of us here.
Yeah, and I also think, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I go to Target to buy things because it's the closest. Of course, there's always going to be those kind of things that you do or buy or interface with that you do because it's easy and accessible, and the best kind of solution for your family or your life. But I think we're talking about those more kind of deep, extensive purchases. We're talking about those things that really intertwine with your business or your life. Think about, if you, okay, perfect example. We need a new roof. And we interviewed sort of 5 people. Um, 2 of them didn't show up, so they were automatically out. And one of them was extremely late, and even late on the rescheduled day. And automatically, John and I were just like, we can't. That's, that person showed us their personal brand is a very late and untrustworthy person. And the other person gave us a quote, and they just didn't seem too into it. They felt, the quote was fine. It was a little bit less than the one we ended up going with. But the one we ended up going with, he just seemed so passionate about roofing. He was a recommendation from our property manager. He stopped by our house and gave us samples. He just chatted on the phone with John and told us about his family, and I just felt like he was like a friend. And I was like, all right, this man is giving us a significant investment into our home, that we are going to have for a long time. So if someone's going to be on the top of my house installing a roof that could dictate the future of our home, yeah, I really want to make sure I like that person. And that is, not even adjacent to what Brian and I do. So, if, whether you're a roofer or a writer, instilling trust and liking the people that, do business with you or vice versa is critical. So hopefully that example kind of it resonates and gives you a good idea of why knowing the people behind the brand are so important, because you are investing in them. You're, sharing your business or your house or your life with them for an extended period of time, and you want to make sure that you like them. Um, and anything else? So I'm looking at our list to make sure that we covered everything. Um, yeah, and I think at the end of the day, when you do all these things in a way that feels right to you, you are going to naturally just elevate your leadership presence, because you have found that sweet spot of things that feel right to share. You are authentically doing it and writing it, and then you are showing up as yourself. What else, Brian? Oh, we didn't talk about our process. That's right. So, a lot of times people will write for them. People will say like, "Oh my God, it sounds just like you, like me. You really captured my voice. How do you do it?" Number one trick: record. Um, Obviously, we are not just writing exactly what you have said, because there's a lot of ums and ahs and kind of back and forth. But one big tip I have is to record yourself, because then you can kind of figure out how you sound, and you can really write from your actual voice. And for us as writers, that allows us to hear your voice, determine the words that you use. I say the word definitely a lot. But you may not use that word, so I'm not going to pop that into your text. You may use a different word a lot. So I'm going to use your language when I'm writing your text. So that really carves out the base for me when I am writing your posts for you. That's how I'm making sure I actually sound like you. And then I'm kind of taking everything you said, right? Like what I am saying right now is not what the post would be at all. Brian and I are just kind of having a casual conversation. I would take this recording and then kind of put it together in a succinct post that feels like my voice.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. It's like you got to get to know the person, and then you have to be able to have empathy and kind of understand who they are, what makes them tick, and have empathy for that. And I think it's the same thing like when you're writing for a specific person as when you're writing for your audience. You have to do the same basic thing. Who is your audience? And maybe the way you get to figure that out is actually talking to people, talking to actual customers, talking to potential customers. How do they talk? What do they say? What is important to them? What are the kinds of stories they tell, and how do they tell them? That is a very similar process that puts you into the audience mindset, the audience perspective, and then helps you relate to them better so that you know how to talk to them. Because people like to buy and do business with people that they can relate to.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that concept of empathy, because that's really what I try to do, is put myself in your shoes when I am writing your content for you. And one other kind of example, and we can have a follow-up conversation on this. I'd love to bring our other partner, Michelle. I'm calling you out. We can talk a little bit more about this from an executive presence, because I do think it is a little bit different. But one thing, if you're feeling like the writing, or you really don't want to toss it over to somebody, doesn't feel aligned, a video is an awesome solution. And that's what we do sometimes for our clients, is we really kind of give them the direction, and recognizing that they don't want us to write it for them, and that's a-okay. What we are doing is providing the strategy, the direction, and we are helping them execute. Because a lot of times this really just has to do with accountability. So I'll make sure we have a part 2, and Michelle and I can talk a little bit about diving a little even more into this topic, but from that kind of executive presence. I think it probably feels a little more natural for people that are entrepreneurs or whatnot. But when you are really tying it to a larger company or just a higher level career, it can feel a little different. So we'll definitely be sure to talk about that, and tagging you, Michelle, for next time. All right, guys. Brian, any final words of encouragement?
Yeah. So I highly encourage you to listen to yourself, listen to your intuition. I've never regretted not posting anything, but when I feel good about something, I am confident and I share it and I put myself out there, and you can too. So just go for it. And I think you'll find that the results are very helpful.
Love it. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll catch you next month.
Sounds good. Thanks so much,
Bye.
Lauren. Bye, everyone.